Folks at Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty have actually been tracking this next area of concern for a number of years. Research Director for the organization, Will Flanders, joins us on the Minuteman Press guest line, and we're going to talk a little bit about the achievement gaps, particularly the racial achievement gaps in Wisconsin's educational structure here. Good morning, Will.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Good to have you here. So we have been talking extensively as we get close to the elections, and some districts are having referendums, and there's all this, talk about funding and if there's enough or too much or it's not being used right and that kind of thing, because people are looking at the test scores and they're not seeing what in many cases makes them happy as far as the achievement outcomes. And that's as a general basis. If you take the data and parse it as Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty has, we find an even more troubling statistic amongst that data, and that's that Wisconsin is apparently doing a very bad job at making sure that all the kids in a classroom somewhere kind of leave that classroom and go on to the next grade with the same baseline level of education. There's an achievement gap.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So if you look at the 2024 national testing, the NAEP, which is a test that's taken around the country, Wisconsin actually has the largest racial achievement gap of any state in the country between black and white students. And this is something that's not new. This is something that's been the case for several years. But what we wanted to do with this research is to go below the surface level. Oftentimes, all you get from the DPI or even from the governor back when he was superintendent is saying, this has to be a problem with racism, and that's sort of the end all be all. That somehow the student's race itself is the reason that this achievement gap exists. But we wanted to dive a little deeper below the surface, which no one's really done before in the state data.
So, in other words, let me just stick on that accusation or assessment for a moment, because that would suggest that, educators and educational institutions, when seeing students of a background or a color or whatever that they were not familiar with, that they might have a little language barrier, whatever the case, that was the problem, and we just could simply say, well, we'll throw some money at this. We'll get teachers who are bilingual. We'll get whatever, and we'll make there be some financial incentives to try and bridge this racial divide that they saw. At least I'll give them credit for seeing it. But the reality is, after years of doing that, we're no better off than we were.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you think about the way the rhetoric works on this, oftentimes it's actually sort of almost blaming teachers or calling teachers either racist or racially insensitive to say that the teachers are the issue. Now, of course, there are some bad apples out there. I'm not going to say that there's no teachers that ever have any sort of bias. Of course, that does exist in the world. But, yeah, what we've done for decades is throw more money at the problem. If you ask Superintendent Underly, what's the solution here? It's throw more money to the schools with more African-American students. Of course, we know that's not going to work. And, you don't even have to look in Wisconsin. You can look at states that are, in fact, doing a better job now, like Mississippi. We spend over $18,500 per student in Wisconsin on average now. Mississippi, with a much more challenging population, both in terms of poverty and in terms of sort of the racial demographics, has surpassed us in fourth grade reading, and they only spend about $14,000 per student. So more money is not the problem. There's a lot of other things we could do to target improvement. That it's not based on targeting improvement, just based on race.
Well, there's a lot of data that's out there and available to people if they want to crunch it, and that's what you guys do over there at Will. What do we have that we can draw some conclusions with to say, okay, this was the early observation. This is what we did. We didn't really improve it any. What's the next level down beneath this? What are some of the other potential causes of this big achievement gap?
Yeah, so when we looked at the data, what we found is that more so than race, what explains this achievement gap that we see is oftentimes poverty. Students that come from lower income backgrounds in general, regardless of the race of the student, tend to have a more challenging time in school. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. We looked a little bit at family structure. Wisconsin, for instance, has the lowest rate of married African-American adults in the entire country. We know that kids that don't come from two-parent families often struggle in school, again, regardless of race. It's just that's correlated there. And also we looked at, the number, the percentage of time that parents are reading to kids at home. And we saw that Wisconsin, there's a big gap between white and Hispanic parents and African-American parents and the percentage that are reading to kids at home. And again, that's probably correlated with poverty as well, right? If you're someone who's having to work two jobs to make ends meet, you may not have time to do those things at home. But again, what it shows is, we shouldn't be focusing on skin color. These are problems that are, they may be correlated with race, but they're not unique to race. And the solutions aren't going to be found by, just focusing on racial solutions. So
if we get into the poverty area as being a major contributor, you have this economic hardship that's going on for a lot of people right now. It gets far worse if you're a single income family, I would think. A single mother, single father, or even a actual nuclear family, but for whatever reason there's a disabled adult or somebody that can't work. And as you say, then we got to go out and find two jobs, and the time to spend with the students is less in the home outside of school. What are we to take away from that, Will, from a standpoint of, okay, so we've identified poverty, schools already claim they don't have enough money. How can schools take that data and adapt what they're doing to have a positive impact, because these poverty situations are outside their control?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is an area where we're moving a bit beyond what schools can control. This is one of the few times I've talked to you where I'm not going to fully say, public schools are to blame for a lot of the issues, right? But what we do know is that, our system of welfare and our social safety nets in this country oftentimes tend to encourage prolonged poverty, right? They have fiscal cliffs where if you go above a certain income threshold, you completely lose access to any funding. And they just allow folks to sort of continue in a state of not even seeking work, right? Just to sort of wallow in the state of poverty. So when we talk about the poverty issue, we're not saying, and now that you know what the problem is, schools, here you go, you can solve it. This is something that goes beyond schools in terms of solving it. It's sort of our entire social welfare system. Good news is with a conservative government in Washington, there are opportunities for reform if we had a like-minded government at the state level. To sort of make some changes in some of those social welfare programs, but it is a long-term change. It's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Well, and to kids in school, I mean, if we're seeing a correlation between poverty, which then cuts down on the available time for many parents to spend more time in those soft educational moments, reading to their kids, talking about the school day, helping them with their math homework, whatever it may be, and we know that, then you would think that as a Department of Education, the state ought to be looking at that, going, all right, what can we do then? Can we offer I don't know, more one-on-ones after the regular school day, or should we be incorporating more reading time in the classroom and maybe a little more or less homework? Whatever it might turn out to be, there's got to be some adjustments that you could make, knowing that you have to make up for a shortfall in the out-of-school time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I shouldn't say it's not completely out of the school's hands. What we should say is that it's it's a holistic approach that'll solve this problem. But within the schools, what we ought to be looking at is, again, we can look to the southern surge states, the states in the deep south, with challenging demographics that are getting better outcomes, and not just like improving relative to Wisconsin. They're in fact getting better outcomes in reading than Wisconsin with these more challenging student populations. And the reason for that is that they focus on the science of reading. And I think at some point we've discussed the science of reading. This is sort of a back to the basics approach to reading education, focusing on phonics. And what we see is that approach, going back to the basics, starting from not just sort of memorization, but actually learning the keys of phonics, actually helps these students in these challenging circumstances to improve and to catch up with their peers. So the DPI has been very neglectful or very reluctant to implement our science of reading law, or to implement science of reading until a law was passed. Now we have a law in the state to implement the science of reading. So hopefully that'll be an impetus to help close the achievement gaps, both along racial and poverty lines.
Well, I've always found the dynamic of public education with the increasing diversity in many areas of the state, and how there are some cultural differences. There are some potential language where even if you learned English as a second language, it's still your second language. You might not excel quite as well in classes being taught in English than being taught in your first language. You've got those situations that go on, and now you have this idea that, well, when the child left you at 3:00 yesterday afternoon, nothing is going to have happened in the home life until they're back in the classroom at 8:00 the next morning, as far as reading or anything like that. We're kind of setting ourselves up as a society for failure here if we don't find a way, and this is not education's problem, but if we don't find a way to kind of, I don't know, address some of these underlying issues, the poverty issue, the cultural issues, and Will, I know that there's a lot of discussion going on these days about how people should integrate or not integrate into society and all that kind of thing. I think whoever live how you want to live, but when it comes to putting everybody in a classroom and saying we have to teach English, and at the end of the year we have to have all the students reading at this level, and then you get to the end of the year and you find out that a third of the class is behind. Is there any assessment that goes on inside schools and school districts and DPI to say, all right, that's the gap, Will has identified it, now we see it, we need to take action in bringing those other kids that are a little bit behind along faster?
Yes, unfortunately, what we often see is that DPI has been more interested in sort of hiding the ball or changing the standards than they are about solving problems. So a couple of years ago, we had lowered the cut points on the forward exam so that students that were previously classified as not proficient are now classified as meeting expectations. So I've not seen a lot of effort at the state level to make those changes. At the district level, there's more variety. There's some districts that on their own have implemented the science of reading. There's districts that have implemented more strong and sort of structured discipline programs. That's another big issue in particularly schools with high levels of poverty. So it varies district by district, but there hasn't been a state level notion towards focusing on improvement. And again, what we do see from the governor and the superintendent generally is these sort of platitudes. We need more DEI. We need more teachers, from diverse backgrounds, which, of course, that's not a bad thing. We should have more teachers from all backgrounds, right? But that's not sort of a silver bullet to solve the issue.
Well, as it relates to that, again, there was a push, and I think it goes back probably 12, 15 years now, to do exactly as you said, to say, well, we got this problem, but that's because a student of a different race can't learn from a teacher of a race who's different than theirs. And so we got to get people who, and that's what they said, people who look like me into the classrooms. After 10 years of doing that, that doesn't work.
Yeah, there's very little evidence to suggest that, just having, for instance, an African-American teacher with African-American students is going to have a significant impact on student outcomes. What really matters, again, is getting back to the basics, focusing on proven methods of education that actually do work. And yeah, some individualized attention absolutely can be beneficial, as you sort of mentioned earlier. And again, I touched on the discipline thing. We moved away from strong discipline practices in this state over the last 2 decades. You hear teachers complain about misbehaving students who are, sent to the principal's office and sent back 5 minutes later with a candy. Guess who is harmed by that the most? It's the other students in the classroom who want to learn, and particularly in our heavily minority areas. We don't have the most integrated schools in Wisconsin, so oftentimes it's other members of the same racial group that are harmed by these soft discipline policies that are supposedly meant to be politically correct and help. So There are a laundry list of things that can be improved or can be worked on, but focusing on purely teacher diversity for diversity's sake absolutely is not a key solution.
Well, and I find it interesting that now, again, that we have some years and some data behind us, that you've been now able to take this and boil it down and say, well, here's kind of the truths if we really want to face them, and then we'll have to go forward. And the idea that you can make kids succeed by making them, and their families by extension, less accountable in areas has always had me scratching my head. The idea that, well, we're not going to use A, B, C, D, and F anymore because the kids that get F get discouraged and they won't learn. Well, in my house, the F was a pretty good motivator because I knew that if I got the F, there was going to be some talking going on at the home. I know that's different these days, but we can see that relaxing those standards, reducing those cut scores to make everybody feel better isn't doing what it was meant to do for the outcomes.
No, you're 100% correct there. What we see is that since the COVID-19 school closures, proficiency has gone down across the board, and we'll have new testing data this fall, but I suspect we're not going to see any huge dramatic improvements in this year's testing because our trajectory has been sort of a big decline in COVID and then sort of flat. We're sort of stagnating at these new levels of proficiency. All these schools around the state are touting their graduation rates and graduation rates being at record highs. Well, if we're graduating kids who can't even read, who can't read a job application to get a job, those graduation rates ring kind of hollow. So lowering the standards across the board, pushing kids through the system that aren't prepared, not just a problem in, for the minority folks we were focusing on in this study, but really those are problems that are across the board in Wisconsin education.
One of the other places that I know there's been a long-term achievement gap, and it's one of the things that comes up now in budget discussions in the state, Will, is special needs students. So not necessarily just somebody that's of a poverty background, but that truly that have learning disabilities of that type. And I'm sure that accounts for at least some of the achievement gap here. Does this report go into looking at that as a piece of the overall statistics of achievement gap?
Yeah, that's another point that I've neglected to bring up here is that, so what we found is that, poverty explains about 42% of the achievement gap. Disability status explains about another 3 to 4% of the achievement gap. What we do see in Wisconsin and across the country is that minority students tend to be diagnosed with disabilities at a higher rate. This often, we can get into, this could be a whole other conversation, right? Is that we're seeing an overdiagnosis of a lot of disabilities, particularly in the behavioral realm. And, when we see students are misbehaving, it's easier to put them on an IEP than it is to sort of deal with the problem and discipline the student. Mm-hmm. So disability status accounts for another 3 to 4%. It's a smaller contributing factor, but it absolutely matters as well. And it goes back to that overdiagnosis problem that we're seeing across the state and the country.
Well, again, I think that this is important information for us to have as voters as we go into an election cycle here where we're going to be voting for every state assembly representative and the local school boards and all those kinds of things here over the next year. So having this information is good baseline for people to ask questions of people that are going to want to hold those offices.
We hope so. That's what we want to do is get the information out there. And, let's hope that our candidates, particularly next time we have a superintendent race or school board races, let's get below the surface level and let's see the extent to which we can focus on the real problems here, which are not skin color, not skin color of the student, not skin color of the teacher. And let's stop as George W. Bush said, the soft bigotry of low expectations. I lost my favorite phrase there for a minute, but we're continually suffering from that in our educational system, and it's time to bring that to an end.
All right. Well, the report is published in its entirety now on your site. Is that right?
That's correct. You can go to will-law.org and read it today.
All right. Hopefully people will take a look at it. It's got some interesting data points in there and should help us to think about what the priorities should be to get the kids the information and the education that they need. Thanks, Will.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.